Everyone avoided the Indian billionaire until the waitress shocked him by speaking Hindi. Why did everyone avoid the Indian billionaire? And what could have been so shocking about a waitress speaking Hindi? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you love emotional stories filled with unexpected moments and powerful human connections, you're in the right place. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for being here, watching, and supporting the channel. Your support means more than you know. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, how would you react if a waitress suddenly spoke Hindi to an Indian billionaire? Now, let's step into this intriguing story and discover how it all began. Don't seat him there, a guest hissed, as silverware paused midair and 12 faces turned away. The private dining room of the Whitmore Grand had been built to flatter power. Crystal caught the chandelier light. Jazz floated low from hidden speakers. Plates arrived under silver domes, each one placed with practiced silence by 6 staff members who knew how to move without disturbing money. Then Ethan Whitmore walked in, and the room did something uglier than stare. It recoiled. 3 executive associates entered behind him, all polished shoes and careful smiles, but they left a clean gap around him as if distance itself were etiquette. At the far end of the room, one woman lowered her wine glass and leaned toward her husband. Another man checked his phone with theatrical urgency, pretending not to see the empty seat beside him. A couple who had spent the last 10 minutes begging the maitre d' for visibility suddenly wanted privacy. Everyone knew Ethan's name. That was not the problem. It was the stories attached to it. Ruthless acquisitions, cold negotiations, a boardroom style that stripped companies down to bone. Over the past year, business pages had painted him as the man who could buy anything except affection. The kind of billionaire who entered a room and made people calculate risk before courtesy. So they smiled at him with their mouths and avoided him with everything else. Ethan noticed. Of course he noticed. He was 42, broad-shouldered, sharply dressed in a charcoal suit that looked cut to command silence. And he carried himself with the rigid economy of a man who had learned long ago that weakness invited appetite. His face did not change as the room shrank from him. That was the part that made people more nervous. No anger, no plea, just a controlled stillness, as if rejection had become another expense he had already budgeted for. Within seconds, silence. Not total silence. Worse, the selective kind. Forks resumed. Glasses touched linen. Conversations restarted everywhere except near him. Amara Brooks saw it from the service station beside the wine wall. 29. Black apron. Hair pinned back with brutal neatness because fine dining management called softness unprofessional on women who looked like her. She balanced a tray on one palm and watched the room perform its polished cruelty in perfect sequence. No one said Ethan was unwelcome. They did not need to. The empty chair did the talking. She had seen rich people punish each other before, usually with invitations, glances, and silence expensive enough to count as violence. But something about this felt coordinated. One of the executive associates pulled out a chair for Ethan, then immediately sat 2 seats away himself. A dining guest gave a bright laugh at nothing, too loud, too quick. Near the doorway, one staff member looked to the floor, then to Amara, then away again. Fear traveled faster than speech. Ethan remained standing for one extra beat, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair that no one wanted to share. A tiny pause, barely visible. Yet in that pause, Amara caught the only honest thing in the room. Fatigue. Not weakness. Not embarrassment. Something older. Something worn in. He sat. The chair across from him stayed empty. The restaurant manager, Leonard Pike, adjusted his cuff links and drifted toward the service station with the expression of a man who cared more about optics than oxygen. Keep that section moving, he muttered to staff without looking directly at anyone. No hovering. No special attention. We are not creating a scene. Not creating a scene meant allowing one. Amara set down her tray. He hasn't even gotten water. Leonard finally looked at her. Someone else will handle it. No one moved. That was the detail that changed everything. Not the whispers. Not the turned shoulders. Not even the theatrical indifference of 12 wealthy patrons. It was this. In a room designed for service, a single man had been quietly removed from it. Amara looked at Ethan again. He had opened the menu but was not reading it. Crystal glasses hummed under the chandelier light. Silverware clicked. Somewhere near the piano, a jazz note thinned and vanished. Amara kept her tray balanced on one hand and watched the one thing no one else in that room seemed willing to see. Ethan Whitmore's water glass was still empty. In a place where 6 restaurant staff could notice a napkin folded half an inch wrong, that kind of absence was not an accident. It was a decision. Leonard had already made his. So had the others. Amara crossed the carpet anyway. One of Ethan Whitmore's 3 executive associates saw her moving toward the table and gave the smallest shake of his head, a warning disguised as elegance. Don't. Leave him there. Let the room keep pretending. That was the unspoken order hanging between the candlelight and the polished marble floor. Amara ignored it. She set down a chilled bottle, reached for the stemless glass, and poured. The water caught the light like cut ice. Ethan Whitmore looked up at last, not startled, exactly, but alert in a way that suggested he had spent enough evenings being watched to recognize the rare moment when someone actually chose to act. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low, controlled, not warm, not cold, just careful. Amara nodded and began to step back, but something in the air tugged at her attention. Not his watch. Not the custom jacket draped with almost mathematical precision over the chair. Not even the fact that 12 wealthy patrons kept glancing over and then away as if eye contact itself might stain them. It was the menu. He had opened it upside down. Only slightly. Enough to tell the truth. A person could fake confidence with posture, with silence, with expensive shoes and a billion-dollar expression. But not with that tiny mistake. Not in the first quiet minute after being abandoned by an entire dining room. Amara stood still for one beat too long. Then she noticed a second detail. His thumb was resting over one line of the wine list, covering a name written in a looping script beneath the English description. Devanagari. Hindi. A small print note about the vineyard owner's family estate partnership in India, ornamental to most guests, invisible to nearly everyone else. His thumb shifted. The word flashed into view. For the first time that night, Amara understood that the room had not simply decided to avoid him. It had built a story about him, and everyone had chosen to obey it. Ethan Whitmore followed her eyes and closed the menu a little faster than necessary. Interesting, that flicker. Not fear, not embarrassment. Something closer to old reflex. "What is it?" he asked. The question was simple, but the table around him seemed to tighten. One executive associate turned in his chair. 2 guests at the neighboring table fell conspicuously silent. Across the room, one of the 6 restaurant staff nearly dropped a folded linen napkin. Amara could have apologized and walked away. Instead, she made a choice so small no one else would have called it dangerous. "In the note under the Cabernet," she said quietly, "the Hindi is misspelled." Silence. Total silence. Even the soft kitchen swing behind the service doors seemed to stop. Ethan Whitmore's gaze locked onto hers. Really locked. As if the room, the money, the practiced indifference around him had all been pushed backward by one impossible sentence. "You can read it?" he asked. Amara kept her shoulders square. "Yes." One of the executive associates let out a short, disbelieving breath. A guest at table 9 turned all the way around now, shamelessly listening. The performance of ignoring Ethan Whitmore had cracked, and everyone knew it. But the deeper shock was not that a waitress had spoken. It was what she had spoken. Ethan Whitmore opened the menu again and angled it toward her. His voice lowered further, stripped now of the formal polish he had been using like armor. "Then tell me." Amara glanced down. The letters were elegant, but wrong in the way expensive things often were when designed for display rather than meaning. Gold ink curved across the cream paper in decorative Devanagari, beautiful at a distance and careless up close. One vowel mark sat where it did not belong. A consonant had been copied twice. The line that was supposed to honor a regional spice blend had been turned into nonsense by someone who had treated a living language like table decor. Amara Brooks did not touch the menu. She only leaned in enough to read. keeping one hand wrapped around the order pad at her waist. Around them, the luxury dining room kept moving in polished little motions. A server at the far station poured wine for one of the 12 dining guests. 2 members of the restaurant staff crossed near the mirrored wall carrying entrees under silver domes. At the long corner table, the 3 executive associates with Ethan Whitmore had gone too quiet. It says what they wanted it to say, Amara said softly. Not what it actually says. Ethan Whitmore watched her face, not the page. And what does it actually say? The chandelier light caught the edge of the menu as she angled it slightly. This line was meant to describe saffron rice with roasted fennel. Instead, it reads like a broken list of unrelated words. The next line is worse. They tried to write a welcome greeting. It comes out insulting. A beat, then another. Within seconds, silence. Not full silence. This was a hotel restaurant, not a church. But the kind that spreads when a room senses rank has shifted. A fork paused halfway to a mouth at one of the guest tables. One of the executive associates stopped pretending to scan his phone. Near the service station, one of the 6 restaurant staff looked over too quickly and then looked away. Ethan lowered his eyes to the menu at last. Insulting how? Amara hesitated. Not from doubt. From consequence. The first mistake had been linguistic. The second had been human. Whoever approved the design had assumed no one who mattered would know the difference. It reads, she said, voice still low. Sit quietly and take what is given. The air changed. A laugh almost escaped from one of the executive associates, but it died the moment Ethan looked up. No anger flashed across his face. That would have been easier for everyone. What came instead was worse, stillness. Cold, exact stillness. Who wrote this? Ethan asked. Amara shook her head once. I don't know. You recognized it immediately. Yes. You speak Hindi fluently. It was not a question, but it landed like one. Several nearby ears tilted toward them without the owners daring to turn fully around. Amara kept her shoulders square. Yes. For the first time that night, Ethan looked shaken in a way money could not cover. The room knew him as a man people avoided for reasons too expensive to discuss out loud. Deals. Temper. Power. A billionaire businessman whose arrival bent service around itself. Yet now he was staring at a waitress as if she had stepped through a wall no one else could even see. Why didn't anyone else catch it? He said. Because no one expected the words to mean anything, Amara answered. They only expected them to look exclusive. That struck harder than the translation. At the bar, glass met glass with a tiny chime. One of the dining guests openly turned now, curiosity beating etiquette by an inch. The executive associates exchanged a glance sharp with discomfort. If Ethan had chosen this restaurant for impression, status, or control, the menu in his hand had just betrayed all 3. He closed it carefully. Too carefully. Read the rest, he said. Amara blinked. All of it. All of it. This time the risk belonged to her in a new way. Correcting one line was a private mercy. Correcting the entire menu in front of him, in front of staff, in front of wealthy guests and his own business circle, could turn her from useful into unwelcome before dessert was plated. A waitress was not supposed to expose the stagecraft. She was supposed to glide through it. Crystal stemware caught the chandelier light and threw it across the tablecloth like fractured ice. The room had not grown louder after his command. It had grown thinner. Even the low jazz near the bar seemed to pull back. Amara kept the cream menu steady in both hands, though she could feel her pulse against the paper. One correction had been a kindness. The rest would be a verdict. She lifted her eyes once. Ethan Whitmore did not rescue her from the moment he had created. He leaned back in his chair, one hand near his untouched water glass, and watched with a stillness that felt more dangerous than anger. His 3 executive associates looked between them, confused now rather than amused. Around the dining room, the 12 wealthy guests had not returned fully to their meals. The 6 restaurant staff moved carefully, pretending not to listen while hearing everything. Amara drew in a breath. The script is elegant, she said quietly, in Hindi first, then in English for the table. But several words were chosen for how they look, not for what they mean. A flicker crossed Ethan's face. Not offense. Recognition. She went line by line, not performing, not grandstanding, simply restoring sense where decoration had replaced language. A poetic description of saffron had been printed as a phrase closer to funeral ash. A blessing above a lamb dish had used the wrong vowel and turned gracious hospitality into nonsense. The final dessert line, intended to suggest sweetness lingering on the tongue, had instead hinted at silence spread across a grave. One of the associates gave a short, embarrassed laugh, then stopped when no one joined him. Amara lowered the menu at last. "It's beautiful typography," she said. It just wasn't checked by someone who could actually read it. That landed harder than the earlier correction, not because her voice sharpened, because it did not. Within seconds, silence. Then Ethan did something stranger than pride. He asked a question. "Where did you learn?" It should not have mattered. A wealthy man asking a waitress about a language in the middle of service should have been a footnote, a pause before the normal cruelty of hierarchy resumed. But the room had shifted too far already. Amara hesitated. The safe answer would have been brief. The honest one cost more. "My mother cleaned rooms in Edison, New Jersey," she said. "For years. A family stayed at the motel every winter from Jaipur. They had a daughter near my age. She hated practicing alone. I helped her with English. Her grandmother helped me with Hindi." A small breath touched her smile and vanished. "They stayed 4 winters. I kept studying after they left." One of the staff near the service station glanced over before looking down again, as if hearing her life spoken aloud made her somehow unfamiliar. Ethan's fingers, which had rested so casually near the glass, curled once against the linen. "And now you wait tables." The sentence could have been insult. In his mouth, this time, it came out like a failed equation. "And now I wait tables," Amara said. She could have left him there, boxed in by his own assumptions. Instead, she added, "Knowing something and being paid for it are not always introduced to each other." That was the conversation that should have ended there. A line, a history, a truth too small to disturb people who bought wine by the bottle and measured others by title. Yet something in Ethan's expression changed with unsettling precision. He was no longer looking at her as an interruption. He was looking at a piece that did not fit the story he preferred about the room, about labor, maybe about himself. The nearest associate reached for damage control. "Well," he said too brightly, "at least the misprint was caught before the investor dinner next week." Investor dinner. The words landed like a dropped tray. Amara turned slightly. "Next week." The associate nodded, relieved to speak to anyone but Ethan. "Private event. International guests. Same menu concept, I assume. We printed a full run this afternoon." A full run. A full run meant boxes. Thick ivory cardstock. Gold foil headers. Dozens, maybe hundreds, already stacked somewhere behind the polished walls of the hotel, all carrying the same polished mistake into a room where money would be watching. For the first time that evening, the pressure did not come from a table, or a glance, or a careless order tossed at a waitress as if she were part of the furniture. It came from the future, from next week, from an audience larger than this room. One of the restaurant staff near the service station went still with a water pitcher in hand. Another lowered her eyes. Across the dining room, several of the wealthy guests had already leaned toward one another, scenting blood the way social circles always did when embarrassment threatened to become public. The 3 executive associates were no longer smiling. They were calculating. Amara Brooks did not move right away. She was doing the arithmetic no one else wanted to do. If the printed menus for the investor dinner carried the same awkward Hindi line, then this was no private blunder. It was a corporate one, a cultural one, the kind that could survive screenshots long after apologies went cold. Ethan Whitmore understood at a heartbeat later. The shift in his face was small, but in a man like him, small was thunder. His hand, which had rested so casually near the edge of the linen, pulled back. Not from anger this time, from recognition. He looked at the associate who had spoken. "How many?" The associate swallowed. "Around 200 menus." Silence. The jazz still floated somewhere overhead, but now it sounded far away, as if the restaurant itself were backing out of the scene. Amara finally answered the question no one had asked her directly. "If they go out like that, she said, steady and clear. Your guests won't read it as a typo. They'll read it as performance. Like someone wanted the appearance of respect without doing the work. That landed harder than the original correction, because it was not only about language anymore. It was about motive. About the kind of expensive ignorance that thought decoration and understanding were the same thing. One of the dining guests gave a low murmur. Another lifted a phone, then seemed to think better of it and lowered it again. The room knew scandal when it heard one being born. Ethan Whitmore could have ended it there. He could have told her to step away. He could have bought the room back with volume, with authority, with the old trick of making discomfort belong to someone with less power. He did not. Instead, he asked, "Can it be fixed tonight?" Every head near the table turned to Amara. The question itself changed the air. A billionaire businessman was no longer asking whether a waitress had overstepped. He was asking whether she was the only person in the room who could stop a larger humiliation. Amara felt the trap inside the opportunity at once. If she said no, the mistake would survive into next week and stain everyone tied to it, including the restaurant staff who would have to serve that room under the shadow of it. If she said yes, she would be stepping into work above her role, in front of people who had spent the last 20 minutes deciding whether she belonged in their line of sight. And if the correction failed, failure would not land on Ethan Whitmore first. It would land on her. She looked toward the service station, where 5 of the other restaurant staff had gone very quiet, and one watched her with open worry. Useful could become blame in a matter of minutes. Maybe legal should review it tomorrow, one associate said quickly. No need to escalate tonight. That was not caution. That was protection. Not for the truth, but for the hierarchy. Amara turned her eyes back to the table. Tomorrow is too late if people have already approved the wrong version today. The associate stiffened. But Ethan Whitmore moved first. Not with anger. Not yet. He reached across the white linen, lifted the sample folder, and opened it himself. Crystal light slid over the glossy pages. Around him, the 12 dining guests pretended not to stare, though every fork had already paused. The 3 executive associates no longer looked polished. They looked cornered. "Show me," Ethan Whitmore said. The room changed on that sentence alone. Amara Brooks stepped closer, careful, steady, one hand still holding the tray against her hip. She did not touch the folder. She only pointed to the line beneath the welcome message, where a phrase in Hindi had been printed with formal elegance and fatal error. It was not a typo anymore. Not after a full run. Not after approvals. It had become a message. A wrong one. "It doesn't say what you think it says," she said. One associate gave a brittle laugh. "With respect, we hired a certified language consultant." Amara Brooks did not look at him. Then the consultant translated the words and missed the wound inside them. That landed harder than anyone expected. Ethan Whitmore's eyes lifted from the page to her face. For the first time all evening, there was no impatience in them. Only a kind of sharpened caution. What wound? The jazz from the far corner seemed suddenly too thin for the silence around that table. Amara Brooks drew a breath. She understood, in one flashing instant, that this was no longer about grammar, branding, or hospitality. It was about why a room full of wealthy Americans had spent the night avoiding a man whose money could buy the building they sat in. She kept her voice low. "The phrase is technically polite, but in the context you're using, it sounds like someone trying too hard to prove he belongs. To a native speaker, it reads less like confidence and more like borrowed dignity." The words did not strike him all at once. They unfolded. Borrowed dignity. Across the table, one of the dining guests slowly lowered his wine glass. A member of the restaurant staff at the service station stopped wiping the same glass for the 3rd time. Ethan Whitmore looked back down at the page. The chandelier light caught the hard angle of his jaw. "Go on." One associate shifted. "This is inappropriate." "No," Ethan Whitmore said, still reading. "What's inappropriate is approving language none of you understood." That shut him up. Amara Brooks felt the danger deepen, not lessen. He was listening now, really listening. And that made the next truth more costly. She set the tray down on an empty side stand, freeing both hands. "People don't avoid you because you're rich," she said. "Plenty of rich men are in this room." No one moved. They avoid you because they can't tell whether you want respect or surrender. And this message, she tapped the air above the printed line, not the page itself, sounds like it was written by people who think culture is a costume that makes you look arrogant to some people and insecure to everyone else. One of the executive associates flushed deep red. Another stared at the tablecloth as if the weave might save him. They had built the image around him, polished it, exported it, and in a single minute, a waitress had exposed the flaw beneath the shine. But Ethan Whitmore did not snap. That was the real shock. Something old and private moved behind his expression, then settled into view. Not weakness, memory. When I was 14, he said, and the entire table seemed to lean inward without meaning to. My mother took me to a charity dinner in Boston. She had one good dress. I had one suit that didn't fit. His thumb rested on the edge of the sample page. A man heard her accent and asked which family she worked for. No one breathed. She smiled and answered him in better English than he spoke. Then she made me promise never to beg a room to let me in. The words were quiet. Their effect was not. Amara Brooks saw it then. The hidden engine beneath the reputation. Not simple pride. Not cruelty for sport. A life built against humiliation so completely that even ordinary caution looked like contempt. He had not just learned to own a room. He had learned to strike before it could judge him. And someone at this table had turned that wound into a brand strategy. Ethan Whitmore closed the folder with deliberate care. The sound cracked through the silence like a judge's gavel. Who approved the final text? No one answered fast enough. One associate finally spoke. We all signed off, but the cultural framing came from external guidance. We can contain this by delaying tomorrow's distribution and adjusting the guest list messaging. Contain. There it was again. Not correction. Concealment. Ethan Whitmore stood. The chair legs whispered across marble. Several dining guests looked down at once, suddenly fascinated by their plates. Not tomorrow, he said. His gaze went first to the three associates. Then, unexpectedly, back to Amara Brooks. Tonight, he said, and not in private. The words hit the room like cold water. Because now the question was no longer whether the mistake could be fixed. It was whether Ethan Whitmore was about to expose the people who built his power or expose himself with them. Crystal glasses caught the chandelier light and threw it across the white tablecloths like shards of ice. No one reached for a fork. The 6 restaurant staff held themselves in that trained stillness luxury demanded, while the 12 dining guests pretended not to listen and failed completely. At the center of it all, the 3 executive associates looked less offended than alarmed. They understood what tonight meant better than anyone else in the room. One of them recovered first. This is not the place, he said, lowering his voice as if softness could make control look reasonable. There are confidentiality obligations, regulatory timing, investor sensitivity. Amara Brooks stood with the empty water pitcher still balanced in one hand. She had not asked to be part of this table, this mistake, or this dangerous circle forming around it. But she also knew what had happened now. She knew the translated draft she had glanced at was not a harmless typo. Key language had been altered. A partnership clause had been softened in English and hardened in Hindi, enough to trap smaller suppliers in terms they had never truly accepted. That was the old question answered. The version was wrong, deliberately wrong. A restaurant manager crossed the room fast, face pale beneath practiced hospitality. Amara, he said quietly, almost through his teeth, step away from the table. The room felt smaller at once. Not because of volume, because of consequence. This was no longer about whether she was right. It was about whether she would keep speaking after understanding the cost. Amara set the pitcher down carefully. The silver base clicked against the tray. If I step away, she said, her voice steady enough to shame shakier people, they'll say this came from nowhere. The manager's jaw tightened. He was not cruel. That made it worse. He was scared. Scared for the restaurant, for the hotel, for his own job, and maybe for hers most of all. You are staff, he said. You are not part of this meeting. Ethan Whitmore did not interrupt. That silence mattered more than a defense. It left the choice entirely with her. One associate reached into his jacket and slid a business card across the linen toward the edge of the table, toward Amara, as discreetly as someone offering a bribe in a church. "Call this number in the morning," he said. "There can be a consulting arrangement if your language skills are useful. Tonight, let this go." Money. Quietly offered. Quietly priced. The insult in it was almost elegant. Amara looked at the card but did not touch it. Behind her, one of the restaurant staff inhaled sharply. Across the room, several of the dining guests had stopped pretending and were openly watching now, their phones still down but their attention absolute. She understood the shape of the trap. If she accepted, she disappeared into a private settlement. If she refused and kept talking, she could lose the only stable paycheck she had. Rent was due in 6 days. Her mother's prescription refill was due sooner than that. Courage sounded noble from a distance. Up close, it had bills attached. The manager made his decision for her. "Turn in your apron," he said. Silence. Within seconds, the room changed. The words landed harder than shouting could have. One of the dining guests looked up sharply. A member of the restaurant staff froze with a dessert plate in hand. Even the associate who had offered the card seemed surprised the punishment had come so fast and so publicly. Amara's fingers moved to the knot at her waist. There it was. The real price. Not embarrassment. Not attention. Livelihood. Her hands shook once. Only once. Then she untied the apron and folded it with maddening care, as if dignity could be creased neatly and placed aside. She laid it on the service tray next to the pitcher. Then she did the thing no one at that table expected. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and placed it on the linen in front of Ethan Whitmore. The screen was already open. A photo. Then another. A hush spread faster than gossip. The glow from the phone lit Amara Brooks's face from below, pale blue against warm gold, while 12 dining guests leaned in without meaning to. On the screen were photographs of old employee schedules, payroll logs, and a grainy image of a younger Ethan Whitmore standing in the back of a small banquet hall beside a woman in a server's uniform. In that picture, his shoulders were narrow, his jaw less certain, his name stitched on a borrowed jacket tag. No one breathed loudly enough to interrupt what the room had become. Amara Brooks did not lift her voice. She did not need to. She tapped one image, then another. A payroll entry, a date, a handwritten note in Hindi along the margin of a training sheet. Then the photograph again. "I know where you learn to hear what others miss," she said. The words landed harder than accusation because they carried recognition. Across the table, the 3 executive associates lost the polished ease they had worn all night. One reached for a water glass and missed it by an inch. Another stared at the phone as if numbers could turn into smoke if he refused to blink. The third finally understood what the evidence meant before anyone else wanted to say it aloud. The story that had followed Ethan Whitmore for years had always sounded simple, cold, ruthless, impossible to approach, a man people avoided because power had made him untouchable. This was uglier and more human. The records on that screen suggested that long before the boardrooms and private drivers, there had been wage theft buried inside a hospitality company tied to one of Ethan Whitmore's earliest family investments. Workers had been underpaid. Complaints had been erased. One of those workers had been the woman in the photograph. His mother. Silence changed shape. The conflict in the room was no longer between wealth and a waitress, or pride and insult. It had become public memory against private myth. One of the executive associates recovered first, which was exactly what men like him trained themselves to do. He straightened in his chair and forced out a brittle laugh. Old records can be misread. Amara Brooks turned the phone toward the center of the table so everyone could see. Then read the signatures. There they were. Approval initials. Processing marks. Payment reductions. Not Ethan Whitmore's hand. Other hands. Older hands. Powerful hands. People connected to the empire that had made him rich and made him feared. People who had hidden behind his reputation because it was easier to let the world call him cruel than admit who had built the machinery around him. The nearest members of the restaurant staff had stopped pretending not to listen. Even from a distance, they recognized the language of payroll fear. Missing hours. Shift changes. Smiling through humiliation because rent did not wait for justice. One of the 12 dining guests quietly lifted a phone. Then another. The tiny screens rose like verdicts. Within seconds, silence had witnesses. Ethan Whitmore looked at the photograph for a long time. Not at Amara Brooks. Not at the associates. At the woman beside the catering trays. At the face he had spent years protecting by becoming harder than the men who had once cornered her in offices and told her to be grateful for scraps. That was the hidden wound behind his reputation. He had learned distance as armor, learned suspicion as survival, learned command because gentleness had not saved the person he loved first. But tonight armor was not enough. The first move was not dramatic. It was devastatingly precise. Ethan Whitmore reached across the linen, took the phone in his hand, and instead of burying it, he stood. Chair legs scraped marble. Heads turned. Forks froze. Even the pianist near the far bar stopped mid-note. "Bring the general manager here," he said to the room, though his eyes never left the evidence. "Now." The order cracked through the chandelier light. A member of the restaurant staff hurried away. The general manager arrived breathless, jacket half-buttoned, apology already forming on his lips. It died there. Ethan Whitmore did not raise his voice. That was worse. He stood beside the table, 6'2" of tailored restraint, Amara Brooks's phone still in his hand, the blue-white light washing over his knuckles. The three executive associates had gone silent in the way powerful men did when they suddenly understood the night no longer belonged to them. Around them, the 12 dining guests watched without pretending not to. The 6 members of the restaurant staff had formed a nervous line of stillness near the edge of the room, trapped between duty and dread. "Is this your dining room?" Ethan asked. "Or a theater for humiliation?" The general manager swallowed. "Sir, if there has been a misunderstanding." "It stopped being a misunderstanding," Ethan said, lifting the phone slightly, "when it became a pattern." Within seconds, silence. The photographs were plain. Dates, faces, notes. A sequence of complaints ignored, then buried. Guests who had laughed. Supervisors who had looked away. Staff schedules altered after anyone spoke up. Not one dramatic crime. Something colder. Easier to deny. Easier to repeat. Amara did not move. Her pulse was visible in the base of her throat, but her back stayed straight. She had risked the paycheck that kept her apartment, her groceries, her life assembled month by month. Now she watched the moment leave her hands and enter his. That was the difference. Earlier in the night, Ethan Whitmore had been the man everyone avoided. Now he was the man no one dared interrupt. "You knew what they were doing to her," he said. The general manager's face went gray. "Mr. Whitmore, I can explain." "No," Ethan said. "You can answer." He turned, not to Amara, but to the room, to witnesses, to money, to the social machinery that had protected men like him for years simply because they were expensive to offend. "Every person here," he said, his voice carrying under the chandeliers, "is looking at what happens when service is mistaken for surrender." No one touched a glass. One of the dining guests lowered her eyes. Another quietly set down the champagne flute she had been holding all evening like jewelry. Even Ethan's 3 executive associates looked as if they had been stripped of language. Then Ethan did something the room had not expected from him all night. He gave the phone back, not like a favor, like an acknowledgement. His fingers closed around the edge for one brief second before he placed it in Amara's palm, careful, deliberate. He looked at her directly, and when he spoke, the arrogance was gone. "You were speaking to me long before you used Hindi," he said. "I just wasn't listening." The sentence landed harder than any threat. Amara's breath caught, not because he had softened, because he had understood. She had not shocked him merely by speaking the language of his childhood, the private cadence no one in that glittering room had expected from her. She had shocked him by reaching the part of him success had armored over. The son who had watched people smile at his father's money and sneer at his mother's accent. The boy who had learned to strike first before contempt could land. And now that old wound stood exposed in public, not as an excuse, but as a warning. He faced the general manager again. "Effective immediately, she is under my protection tonight, and by morning your corporate office will have every file tied to these complaints. If one schedule changes, if one paycheck disappears, if one whisper follows her into another room, I will buy the paper trail myself and lay it in court. The threat was not theatrical. It was administrative, financial, permanent. The general manager opened his mouth, then closed it. Boardrooms feared that tone more than rage. A murmur moved through the dining guests like wind through silk. Phones appeared. Reputations recalculated in real time. Ethan's 3 executive associates exchanged the look of men already drafting distance between themselves and this hotel. Amara finally spoke, and her voice was quiet enough to force everyone closer. I don't need protection forever, she said. I needed one person to stop pretending this was normal. Ethan nodded once. Not as a billionaire. As a man being corrected. By the time he reached for his check, the room had changed shape around them. The staff no longer looked only frightened. Some looked stunned. One looked relieved enough to blink back tears. The dining guests who had spent the evening avoiding Ethan now watched him with something far rarer than fear. Respect, stripped of performance. At the door, he paused and turned back to Amara. If you ever choose to leave this place, he said, you won't need me to tell the world what you're worth. He meant it. She knew because he did not offer rescue. He offered recognition. Amara slipped the phone into her apron pocket and lifted her chin. Good, she said. Then maybe they'll finally learn to hear it the first time. No one laughed. No one looked away. Under the soft gold light, in a room built to flatter wealth, dignity had won the final seat at the table.